In the ancient city of Babylon during the reign of the mighty King Nebuchadnezzar, there lived three young Hebrew men whose names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These were not their original Hebrew names, but the Babylonian names given to them when they were taken captive from Jerusalem as young boys. Their Hebrew names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, which meant God is gracious, who is like God, and God has helped. These three friends had been torn from their homeland when Jerusalem fell to the Babylonian army. Along with many other young Israelites, they were brought to Babylon to serve in the king's palace. Despite being far from home and surrounded by a pagan culture, they remained faithful to the God of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Years had passed since their arrival in Babylon, and the three men had proven themselves wise and capable. They had learned the language and customs of their captors, studied in the royal schools, and risen to positions of responsibility in the government. King Nebuchadnezzar had appointed them to oversee important affairs in the province of Babylon. Yet through all their success and advancement, they never forgot who they were or whom they served. Now King Nebuchadnezzar, in his pride and arrogance, decided to make a statement of his power and the supremacy of Babylon's gods. He commissioned the construction of an enormous golden statue. This image stood 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, gleaming in the sunlight on the plain of Dura, outside the great city of Babylon. The statue was magnificent to behold, crafted by the finest artisans in the kingdom and covered entirely in gold. The king was pleased with his creation and saw it as a symbol of his empire's greatness and the power of Babylon's gods. He decided that this golden image would become the center of worship for all the peoples under his rule. This was not merely about religion. It was about political unity and absolute loyalty to his kingdom. King Nebuchadnezzar sent word throughout his vast empire, commanding all the high officials to come to the dedication of the golden statue. Governors, administrators, judges, treasurers, counselors, and all the provincial officials were summoned to attend this grand ceremony. From every corner of the Babylonian Empire, these important men traveled to the plain of Dura. On the appointed day, hundreds of officials gathered before the towering golden image. The sun reflected off its surface, creating a dazzling display that could be seen from miles away. Musicians were positioned nearby with their instruments: horns, flutes, harps, lyres, and many other musical instruments of every kind. The king's herald stepped forward with a loud voice and proclaimed the royal decree to the assembled multitude. He announced that this was the command of King Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler of the known world. When the music began to play, every person present must immediately fall down and worship the golden image that the king had set up. The herald continued with a stern warning. Anyone who failed to fall down and worship the statue would be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. There would be no exceptions, no mercy, and no second chances. The punishment was clear and final. Worship the image or die in the flames. As the herald finished speaking, the musicians raised their instruments. The sound of horns, flutes, harps, and lyres filled the air. Every person present on the plain of Dura fell to their knees and bowed down before the golden statue. Hundreds of men prostrated themselves in worship of King Nebuchadnezzar's image. Every person bowed down except three. In the midst of all those kneeling figures, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego remained standing. They stood tall and straight, their eyes fixed not on the golden statue, but looking upward toward heaven. While everyone around them bowed to an idol of gold, These three young men remained faithful to the invisible God of Israel. Their refusal to bow was not from stubbornness or rebellion against proper authority. Throughout their years in Babylon, they had served the king faithfully and obeyed his commands. But this command violated the first and most important commandment given by God to their people. You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make idols. Some of the Babylonian officials noticed immediately that the three Hebrew men were not bowing down. These men had perhaps been jealous of the rapid advancement of these foreign captives to high positions in the government. Now they saw an opportunity to bring accusations against them. These accusers quickly made their way to King Nebuchadnezzar to report what they had observed. They approached the king with false courtesy, beginning their report with the traditional greeting of respect and flattery. They reminded the king of the decree he had made and the punishment he had established for disobedience. Then they brought their accusation. They told the king that there were certain Jews whom he had appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon who were not obeying his command. They specifically named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, emphasizing that these men did not serve the king's gods and refused to worship the golden image he had erected. When King Nebuchadnezzar heard this report, he was filled with rage and fury. His face became red with anger. How dare these men, who owed everything to his kindness and generosity, defy his direct command? He had raised them from captivity to positions of honor, and this was how they repaid him. The king immediately ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When the three men were escorted into the king's presence, they came with dignity and calm. There was no fear in their eyes, no trembling in their hands. They stood before the most powerful man on earth with the quiet confidence that comes from trusting in the Almighty God. King Nebuchadnezzar looked at these three men who had served him faithfully for years. Perhaps some part of him hoped there had been a misunderstanding. In his anger, he decided to give them one more opportunity to save their lives. He asked them directly if it was true that they did not serve his gods or worship the golden image he had set up. The king then made his offer. He would have the music played again, and if they would fall down and worship the image, all would be forgiven. They could return to their positions and continue their lives as before. But if they refused, they would be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar, in his pride, asked them a challenging question. What God will be able to rescue you from my hand? In his arrogance, he believed that no God could stand against his power and authority. The three Hebrew men looked at each other, and then Shadrach spoke for all of them. Their answer was clear, respectful, but absolutely firm. They told the king they did not need to defend themselves in this matter. If they were thrown into the blazing furnace, the God they served was able to deliver them from it, and he would rescue them from the king's hand. But then they said something even braver. They told the king that even if their God chose not to save them from the fire, they wanted him to know that they would still not serve his gods or worship the golden image he had set up. Their faith was not dependent on being rescued. Their obedience to God was not conditional on favorable outcomes. They would rather die than betray their God. This answer sent King Nebuchadnezzar into an uncontrollable rage. His attitude toward these three men changed completely. These men who had been his trusted officials were now seen as dangerous rebels who threatened his authority and the unity of his empire. The king ordered that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. This was not just about execution. It was about making a statement. The punishment would be so severe that no one else would ever dare to defy the king's commands. He called for his strongest soldiers, the most powerful men in his army, to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace. The soldiers tied up the three men securely with strong ropes, binding their hands and feet. They were still wearing all their clothes, their robes, turbans, and other garments. The king wanted them thrown into the fire exactly as they were, to show that his power could not be resisted. As the soldiers carried the bound men toward the furnace, the heat was so intense that it was difficult to approach. The furnace had been heated far beyond its normal temperature, and the flames roared with terrifying intensity. The very air around the furnace shimmered with the extreme heat. When the soldiers reached the mouth of the furnace and prepared to throw in their prisoners, the heat was so overwhelming that the flames reached out and killed the soldiers themselves. These strong men who had been chosen for their physical strength were instantly overcome by the blazing fire. They died in the act of carrying out the king's command, while Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell bound into the middle of the blazing furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar watched from a safe distance as his soldiers threw the three men into the fire. He expected that to be the end of the matter. But then something happened that shook him to his very core. The king suddenly leaped to his feet in amazement and alarm. He called to his advisors and asked them if they had not thrown three men, bound with ropes, into the fire. When they confirmed that this was exactly what had happened, the king pointed toward the furnace with a trembling hand. He told them he could see four men walking around freely in the midst of the fire. They were not bound with ropes. They were not being harmed by the flames, and they were walking about as if they were in a pleasant garden rather than a blazing furnace. Most amazing of all, the king said that the appearance of the fourth man was like a son of the God, a divine being who had come to be with the three Hebrew men in their time of trial. King Nebuchadnezzar approached as close to the furnace as he dared and called out to the three men. He addressed them as servants of the Most High God, acknowledging for the first time the supremacy of their God over his own. He commanded them to come out of the fire. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walked out of the blazing furnace, completely unharmed. As they emerged from the flames, all the king's officials, governors, advisors, and nobles gathered around them in amazement. They examined the three men carefully and found that the fire had not harmed them in any way. Not a single hair on their heads was singed. Their robes showed no signs of being scorched. Their clothing was not even damaged. Most remarkably of all, there was not even the smell of smoke on them. They looked exactly as they had before being thrown into the furnace, except now they carried with them the unmistakable presence of divine protection. King Nebuchadnezzar was completely overwhelmed by what he had witnessed. This proud monarch who had challenged God and asked what God could rescue them from his hand now found himself face to face with the undeniable power of the God of Israel. The king began to praise the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He acknowledged that their God had sent his angel to rescue his servants who had trusted in him. He recognized that these three men had been willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. King Nebuchadnezzar then issued a new decree to all the peoples, nations, and languages in his empire. He commanded that anyone who said anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be severely punished, because no other god could save in this miraculous way. The king promoted the three Hebrew men to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. He honored them publicly and restored them to positions of even greater trust and responsibility than they had held before. Through their faithfulness in the face of death, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had not only saved their own lives, but had brought great glory to the name of the Lord. Their courage had resulted in the most powerful king on earth acknowledging the supremacy of their God and issuing a decree protecting all who worshipped him. This story teaches us that God is always faithful to those who remain faithful to him. When we face the choice between compromise and courage, between fitting in and standing out, between safety and faithfulness, we can remember these three young men who chose to trust God completely, regardless of the consequences. If this story has spoken to you today, please subscribe to this channel for more stories of people who through their faith encounter the power of God. Also like this video and share with someone who might need an encouragement today.